few years ago, my daughter Abby and I took a quick whirlwind trip up to Washington, D.C. It's actually one of my favorite places, but not at the last minute. Abby was in her junior year of college and preparing for a semester abroad in Granada, Spain. And not uncharacteristically, and I don't know who she got this from, but not uncharacteristically, Abby had waited to the very last minute to complete the paperwork for her visa application to go abroad, which had to be presented in person at the Spanish consulate in Washington, D.C. Though the trip to D.C. was greatly rushed, we were able to take in a few museums, which were not only interesting, but were also a very welcome relief from the sweltering 100-degree August heat as it radiated off the pavement in D.C. that year. While we were in the Museum of Natural History, we experienced one of those moments that you don't easily forget. We were in one of the dinosaur exhibits, where those massive skeletal structures of these long-gone creatures were towering over us in the big room, gawking at the frail human beings below, and leaving us feeling just a bit like ants. Abby and I noticed a small girl, probably around 4 years old, standing next to her father, holding tightly to his hand and looking up at those imposing skeletons of the enormous creature that was before her. And tugging on her father's hand, he leaned over very gently to hear what she had to say. Wide-eyed, and in a whisper that echoed through that whole cavernous marble room, the tiny girl voiced what seemed to be half proclamation and half question. "Don't worry, Daddy," she whispered. "I think it's dead." My mind wandered back to this story as I listened to the teacher's wisdom recorded in the ancient book of Ecclesiastes. Beyond the poetic rhythms of that familiar passage, "For everything there is a season," you know, that one which was made into a 60s ballad that we all love to hear. Besides those words, Ecclesiastes is not a part of the Bible that is often read in church. And after hearing the passage this morning, perhaps you can imagine why. It can be a bit of a downer, actually. The teacher seems to feel that all of his efforts, or all of her efforts, really count for nothing. Vanity is everything, says the teacher. The teacher moans about the reality that another generation is coming along, and there's nothing to stop them from squandering the fruits of the teacher's fastidious labor. And in fact, when the teacher looks around, there's evidence that the teacher's evidence really aren't even making a difference in the world anyway. The teacher concludes, apparently, that there's nothing better to do in life than to eat and to drink and to be merry in the present moment, because tomorrow you will die. We might pause and wonder how this piece of writing ever got into the Bible to begin with. So much of the Bible seems to work against this kind of pessimistic message, and suggests instead that despite the presence of evil, God is indeed working God's purpose out. Redemption and healing are possible. Life and love will prevail. But even though you, like me, might embrace that perspective, I think the presence of the teacher's wisdom in Ecclesiastes stands as a timeless testament to the honesty of the feeling in the teacher's words. What one of us does not have days when we too feel that our efforts are simply not making a difference, and that our life is completely in vain? Days when nothing goes right, and the more we do to try to fix things, the worse they seem to get. Even worse, we take in the news around us of the continual warring of nations and the continual warring of politicians within our own nation, the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, the continuing racial prejudice and injustice in our country, which was brought to the painful light of day once again, as if we needed a reminder, in the wrongful death of Trayvon Martin, and the dangerous lack of concern that we continue to have for the health of the earth, which is our very sustenance. Like the teacher of Ecclesiastes, some days we cannot help but feel that the human experiment will end up much like the dinosaur, on display in some museum for future beings to finally pass the judgment, "I think it's dead." And then add a whisper, "and not a moment too soon." Hebrew scholars suggest that the literal meaning of the word translated as vanity in Ecclesiastes more literally means a puff of wind. A puff of wind. Everything, the teacher says, is a puff of wind. Meaning, I suppose, that everything is ephemeral. Everything is passing. Nothing lasts. And not much makes a difference. And yet, as much as I feel that way sometimes, I wonder, even given every reason to be pessimistic, I still wonder. After all, a puff of wind can warm a cold hand. A puff of wind can bring forth the hauntingly beautiful tone of an oboe. In CPR, we're trained that a puff of wind followed by another puff of wind and another can possibly save a life. And God's puff of wind at creation brought forth the entire world. I am reminded of a story that I first heard from my favorite college religion professor, Dr. Michael McLean. And to his credit, he could never tell this story without breaking into tears. It's a story told by the great naturalist Loren Isley in his book, The Star Thrower. One day, a wise man was walking along the beach. It was dawn, and up ahead he saw a human figure moving like a dancer. He smiled to himself at the thought of someone who would dance in the day, and so he walked faster to catch up with this figure. As he got closer, he noticed that the figure was that of a young man, and that what he was doing was not dancing at all. The young man was reaching down to the shore into the sand, picking up small objects and throwing them into the sea. He came closer still and he called out to the young man, "Good morning. May I ask what you're doing?" The young man paused, looked up, and replied, "Throwing starfish into the ocean." "I must ask then, why are you throwing starfish into the ocean?" asked the somewhat startled old wise man. To this the young man replied, "The sun is up and the tide is out. If I don't throw them in, they'll die." Upon hearing this, the wise man commented, "But young man, do you not realize that there are miles and miles of beach, and there are starfish along every single mile of this strand? You can't possibly make a difference." At this, the young man bent down and picked up another starfish and flung it into the ocean. As it met the water, he said, "It made a difference to that one." And then he took the next step down the shore. Friends, I appreciate the teacher's honesty in Ecclesiastes. And I have days, and I must admit lately, many more days, when I feel exactly the same way. But ultimately, I cannot share his cynicism. As with the starfish thrower, the life of the Spirit reminds me that no loving effort and no just act is ever wasted. A puff of wind may be brief in duration, but a puff of wind's impact may be enormous beyond our knowing. A puff of wind matters. In God's time, it can change the world. Amen.